Mixing History and Fiction in Pentiment. This is a talk I originally gave at the Game Developers Session. This was 1 week ago in Prague in the Czech Republic. I thought that this had fairly broad appeal, at least I hope so, so I thought I should give it again on Twitch. And again, I will be uploading this to YouTube, and yes, there will be a Q&A at the end. Who am I? I hope... Well, I guess this is good for YouTube, but who am I? If you don't know, my name is Josh Sawyer. I'm the studio design director at Obsidian Entertainment. I started in the industry in 1999 at Black Isle Studios. After Black Isle for a few years, I was at Midway San Diego. I didn't spend very long there, as you can see. And then I went to Obsidian Entertainment in 2005, where I've been ever since. That's 18 years, coming up on 19. And I have a bachelor's degree in history, if you were curious, focusing on the early modern Holy Roman Empire, basically where Pentiment is set, and games notably that I've worked on, Icewind Dale 1 and 2, Fallout New Vegas, Pillars of Eternity, and Deadfire, and of course, most recently, Pentiment. So what is this talk about? It's about using fictional elements in historical games. I think you could extend this to the idea of using fictional elements in historical books, fiction, movies, things like that. But obviously this is about this game. Examples are from Pentiment, which came out in 2022. It's just over a year old. The main inspiration conceptually is from Name of the Rose, although it's not that similar in terms of structure. I'm going to be contrasting historical interpretation and historical fiction. And these are just categorizations that I made up. The interpretation is more about kind of a strict retelling of something very well known, and historical fiction gets more into imagineering of things. I want to talk about the advantages of working in history's margins. I think it's very good and fun and cool, and you can do a lot of very interesting things with it. And you can blend improbable possibilities, things that are unlikely but possible, to convey meaning about important ideas, which I think is worthwhile in any story. So about Pentiment, if you are not familiar with it, it is a historical narrative game with light role-playing game elements. It is set in Upper Bavaria in the Holy Roman Empire. If you're not super familiar with geography, this is in the extreme southeast part of modern-day Germany, bordering with Austria. Holy Roman Empire between 1518 and 1544. So it's just over 25 years. You play, the main character is Andreas Mahler. He is an artist and he solves mysteries in 3 acts. That's an oversimplification. There are light spoilers, by the way. I did see one comment here. There are very light spoilers. I try to talk around them, not directly to them, but you might notice something. I try not to bust the whole thing open. But yes, Andreas solves mysteries in 3 acts. You start in the town of Tassing and you go to a Benedictine abbey called Kearsau. These are both fictional places. There's a cast of over 100 characters. These are also all fictional characters. However, we reference real places, historical figures, and events throughout the course of the game. And the story itself, though, is entirely fictional. So let's talk about Name of the Rose, which is, for me, the main inspiration for the overall idea of the game, let's say. Primary inspiration. It was a 1980 historical fiction novel by Umberto Eco. It was originally written in Italian and then translated to English a few years later and then into many, many, many other languages. It's a very, very popular book in spite of being quite dense with historical references. It is set in the 14th century in a nameless fictional Benedictine abbey in the Italian Alps. Most of the characters are fictional. You're noticing a trend here. There's a lot of similar things to how I approach Pentiment. Real places, historical figures, and events are referenced, and in fact are very important to the overall structure of the story. Story itself is entirely fictional. All the things that happen in Name of the Rose, other than the framing events, is just fiction. This is a quote from Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. Books are not made to be believed, but to be subjected to inquiry. When we consider a book, we mustn't ask ourselves what it says, but what it means. To sort of understand the deeper significance of this, you need to understand that Eco, in addition to being a novelist, was a medievalist. He was actually a medievalist first and a semiotician. He wrote Name of the Rose, actually almost at the same age that I am right now. He said he turned 48, and that is the age at which people either, or men specifically, he said 48 is the age at which men either sail away to the Caribbean with a ballerina or write a novel. So he decided to write a novel, and it was Name of the Rose. But as a semiotician, he was interested in symbols and meaning. There you go. Books and stories are about meaning and ideas more than they are about fact. This is not just true of history books, but any book. That's the way that Eco looked at them. The protagonist of Name of the Rose solves the mystery in the story. I don't want to spoil all of that, but in many ways, it's a meaningless victory. It's meaningless in a few ways, but there is a deeper meaning to it that is very important. And the Name of the Rose is ultimately about, among other things, the revelation of truth through loss and the very, very fragile nature of history, which I think, as someone who, at least academically, was interested in history, is a very important thing to think and talk about. This is also the subject of other Umberto Eco books, most notably Baudolino, which I quite like, and not many people have read it, so I'll recommend that while we're here. I want to talk about the appeal of historical interpretation. And when I talk about historical interpretation, I'm talking about it separately from historical fiction, where there's a lot of made up stuff. So interpretation, in my opinion, is more of a direct adaptation. So this is based on a quote unquote true story. There are big quotation marks around it. There's a lot of interconnected material to work with. And by the way, there's going to be multiple Ridley Scott references here, but Napoleon, I think, is particularly relevant right now. So there's a lot of interconnected material to work with. People might know, quote unquote, the story. They might know the history or a variety of histories. They want to see this interpretation. So they're like, oh yeah, I know about Napoleon. I've heard about Napoleon. I want to see how this goes down. Other people might know of the story. There's a lot of people who don't know really anything about Napoleon, but they know that he was a guy. He's a historical guy. He's French. Not really. Kind of. That he was a military leader, but beyond that, they don't really know anything else. So they want to learn about it. Great. So there's a great appeal there. And a good example here is Napoleon. Ridley Scott made this historical film. I will say I haven't seen it yet. I've seen a lot of takes about it. I want to see it. However, I have a strict rule about not seeing Ridley Scott films until the director's cut comes out. I'm not going to go into that. But there we go. This is a Napoleonic era film made by Ridley Scott. And guess what? We're going to talk about another one later. Now, there are drawbacks of historical interpretations. You are constrained by those records. Now, you can choose to not be constrained by them, which Ridley Scott certainly chose to do for Napoleon. And you can deal with the consequences. If you don't care and you have a really strong reason to do it, you can do that. But you are constrained by records. You can be influenced by prior interpretations. Also, your audience can be influenced by prior interpretations, even if you choose not to be. So that is a thing you have to think about. There's greater scrutiny when it's a famous figure and there's lots of things written and said about them. You're going to get a lot more scrutiny. It's kind of more difficult to create, quote unquote, an artistic truth because you're working around a set of documents made by different hands with different motives. What that means is when people are just writing things down about battles and things that happened, and you have maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 authors all contributing to your understanding of a thing, there isn't an overarching narrative to it because they're just writing down the things that they find important and are leaving behind that we happen to get. So if you want to craft some sort of greater sort of truth out of it or a big idea, it can be harder when you are dealing with historical interpretation. And these records tend to be about quote unquote great men and great events. By the way, I just want to comment on Jacques-Louis David's from the upper left. This is Jacques-Louis David's Napoleon Crossing the Alps. That's Rod Steiger in Waterloo, which I think a lot of people really, really like. In the lower left, we have Ian Holm in Time Bandits, which is a very comedic sort of interpretation. And then we have, who can forget, Napoleon and Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. So these are all great interpretations in their own way of Napoleon. So let's talk about Great men. So most pre-20th century history was about powerful people. There's lots of reasons for that. This came up in something called the great man theory of history, which is the idea that basically history is moved and shaped almost exclusively in any meaningful sense by extremely powerful people who are typically men in the European history that this guy was writing about. So you have emperors and you have popes and you have kings and you have extremely powerful guys, and we're going to write all about these dudes. And so we have tons and tons of records about Caesar and all these other guys. There's a lot of it. There's a whole lot. It's more likely that regular people are going to know about this. I mean, the great man theory, it funnels all the ideas and, everything comes down to these extremely powerful, important guys. So we learn about them. Oh, that guy. I don't remember who that guy is, but I know that statue, that guy, Napoleon, whoever. So obviously, there are certain things about great men narratives and representation because society is broader than just powerful guys. And powerful guys can be very interesting, and the things they do are very important, but they're not the only thing, and they're not the only people. So marginalized people, by definition, because they're called marginalized, they don't really get much, if any, time in these stories. Criminalized groups. Now, keep in mind that when I say criminalized, I mean like it's literally illegal to be or do these things in these time periods, many of them. So queer people, Jews, Romani, are very often portrayed negatively. So you're not going to get a lot of really fantastic records about these folks, or let's say fair representations. Also, contemporary identities, things that we think of either socially or conceptually, gay, lesbian, transgender, they didn't exist socially. They didn't, in some cases, even exist linguistically, even if the behaviors and the personal identities did. So there is this difficult point between erasure and recognition of existence that is very important to sort of grapple with. And you're not going to really find much of that in sort of great man history. So I'm not saying great man history is bad. There's a lot of interesting stuff you can read about there, but you're going to only get a focus on certain things. So what is the appeal of historical fiction? And here we go. Here's another Ridley Scott. By the way, I did see a comment on Budapest. That was actually fixed. That was an error and it was fixed. Buda and Pest are both separate. So the appeal of historical fiction is that you get to tell a story in the margins of history. So what's involved in this, at least from my perspective, is you research everything that surrounds it, everything that's surrounding it socially, politically. You research the foundation of the time, and then you sort of erase that frame and you build within it. So you create a plausible story within a framework that you might reference lightly, but you're not really telling the story of. History is your foundation, not your prison. And I don't mean to say that history is a prison, but sometimes when you're dealing with something that's very well documented and established, it can feel like you're restricted and you don't have much freedom. So with historical fiction, you get this nice foundation and then you can tell a story within it. So you have a lot more flexibility. Ideas only need to be possible, even if they're not probable. And obviously there are boundaries here. And if you push it too far, it can get maybe grating to certain people. But you're trying to find things that could happen to create a very cool and interesting setting and story. So here's an example, which is The Duelists. And The Duelists is also by Ridley Scott. It was made quite a long time ago. And it was made by, it was actually based on a Joseph Conrad novel. And it's about two officers in fighting in Napoleon's army who conduct a duel over a series of years. It's a fantastic movie. It's beautiful. It's got a really cool story. I think is very fascinating. And all the stuff about Ferrot and Dubert are made up. They don't really matter. I shouldn't say they don't matter, but they're not real people. And the places where they go are places where Napoleon's army went. And it makes sense and it works, but there's a really cool story at the heart of it. And there's a deep meaning to that story, which Conrad and also Ridley Scott were free to explore because it's fiction. And yes, now we're moving on to yet even another Napoleonic reference, although I'm not directly referencing it, but this is Sharp, which is great. So there are drawbacks to historical fiction. First of all, the audience cannot by nature be familiar with the story. You made it up. It's fiction, so they can't know what it is. So they're like, I don't know, the duelists, those guys are from sometime before the Civil War, I guess, maybe. I don't know. Like, if you're expecting, the audience to understand what they're looking at, they probably won't unless they're historians. You have to build your own foundation. So there is a lot of work here. It's fiction, but you still have to do a lot of work. You open a lot of questions about possibility. This is a fun thing, but it's also risky. You have to ask, is this even possible? Can we tell this story? Is this okay? You risk violating records without knowing. A lot of records about, minor things and characters. It gets into sort of social history, and you might say something about a thing that you didn't know. You couldn't find a record, and so whoops, you messed something up. The research foundation is often in microhistory and little people. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but you're going to have to do some digging on this stuff. So let's talk about little people. This is a nice Bruegel painting of, this is The Peasant Wedding, I believe, which is a fantastic painting. By the way, if you look directly above my picture right there and you see the man with the spoon in his hat, that was an inspiration in the film of The Return of Martin Guerre, and it was also the inspiration for the character of Carl and the spoon in his hat. So a lot of people have asked about that. There it is. So in the late 20th century, history shifted to quote unquote ordinary people, regular folks, less about great men and more about just commonplace folks. Microhistory is often a term associated with this. So records are scattered and often disconnected because, again, you got to dig. These are not the main things people are typically historians or people who are acting as historians are talking about. Microhistory is often about a single event or a place or even an individual person and something that is cool and neat about them. Charles Joyner summarized microhistory as a search for answers to large questions in small spaces, which I think is a very fascinating way to look at it. You look at the lives of little people, and often, again, the records that are left of them are not trying to tell some sort of grand narrative, and so you kind of have to read between the lines and create something out of that, which I think is really appealing. So here's the thing. Historical fiction requires as much research as historical interpretation. Excuse me. As lovely as it would be to just make a bunch of things up, you actually do have to do a lot of stuff. You're building something in a historical whole. You have a space and you're going to fill it with fiction. The fiction needs to fit seamlessly within that surrounding history. So obviously, if your audience doesn't know the history, it doesn't matter. But the point is that you are making it within stuff that people have researched. So you want it to fit in and make sense. Fictional text, by the way, this is a side note, but I wanted to make a comment about it. Fictional text needs to be translated into real languages. So in Pentiment, we have a number of documents that are written in German and Latin, and we had to translate all of those. I saw someone comment that they thought that maybe Pentiment might have the most original Latin in any piece of media in the 21st century. It's possible. I mean, there are thousands of words in it that I and Zoe and Heather all wrote to fit into there. So yeah, when you have a lot of that stuff, you have to literally make it all up. Andreas Mahler. This is sort of a hard transition, but let's go for it. Let's talk about the protagonist of the game. He is a journeyman artist from Nuremberg. That's how he starts the story anyway. This is a totally normal thing. Being an artist from Nuremberg, a lot of them, so to speak, in this time period. Easy. He's very well traveled in his Wanderjahre. These are his wandering years in his journeyman time. This is also not that unusual. Journeymen would often, and in some cases still do, travel a great distance during their Wanderjahre before becoming a master. However, he is also a dropout from the University of Erfurt, which is not a common thing for an artist or quote-unquote middle-class person to be in this time period. And he acts as a de facto detective. Detectives did not exist. Police didn't really exist. So he acts as a detective, but this is a sort of weird combination of things. in the story. So how do we kind of bridge this gap? So the original inspiration, sort of in terms of background for Andreas, is Albrecht Dürer. You can probably see right there. So Albrecht Dürer and this specific painting were references for Andreas's vibe. He was an artist from Nuremberg, and his father was a goldsmith. He is very well traveled on his Wanderjahre. In fact, we have a lot of his journals, which is very rare for an artist in this time period. He has a lot of his travel journals from when he traveled to the Low Countries, to Basel, to Italy, and they're very, very interesting. However, he is not university educated, and he's not a detective. Never acted as a detective. However, there's another source of inspiration, which comes from Name of the Rose. So this is the fictional protagonist of Name of the Rose, William of Baskerville. He is university educated. He is educated at the University of Oxford and Paris in a scholastic tradition. He's a Franciscan friar. He is a former inquisitor, about as close as you're going to get to a detective, I guess, in this time period. And he's sort of a combination, Echo has said, of William of Ockham and Sherlock Holmes. And hence his name is William of Baskerville. Very, very on the nose, but it works great. And he investigates a murder in a monastic scriptorium as a de facto detective. So William is not a detective by trade. He just kind of falls into it. And because of his background as an inquisitor and an academic, he is particularly well suited towards it. So let's talk about various crimes I committed against archaeology, which is a field I have less experience and knowledge in. And some of these are for the sake of the story. And others are sort of for vibes, and I'll get into one specific thing here. There are no examples of Roman statues with inscriptions on the helmet. This is probably the most egregious archaeological crime I committed. Yeah, there you go. It is also unlikely you could navigate Roman aqueducts and ruins quite as easily as you can in Pentiment, but it's fun, so there you go. It made for a convenient sort of explanation of a number of things. And there were no known windmills in Bavaria. None at all. It's not really a good place to build a windmill. There are regular mills, certainly in this time period, but not windmills. But I was inspired by a painting, yet another painting by Bruegel the Elder. So we have The Procession to Calvary, which is an incredible painting, made in 1564. So this is a little later than the game takes place, but I think very appropriate. It has a very crowded composition that is in line with what's called the Mannerist style of this time period. And the high point in the scene, which you can barely see above the N in procession, is the mill. And the idea there is that God is the miller watching over everyone. The ideas behind this and the creation of the painting were covered in a book called The Mill and the Cross. That was adapted into a film, which is very slow, but very wonderful. I love it a lot. And there's a great quote in the film. So Rutger Hauer, whom I love, plays the painter, and he says, "My painting will have to tell many stories. It should be large enough to hold everything, all the people." And this quote really stuck with me, and this composition stuck with me. And when we started on Pentiment, I thought it was important, one, that we have a huge cast. I wanted to show every sort of level of society that we could. So we have noblemen and priests and abbots, and we have, executioners and charcoal burners and Romani and Jews and peasants and everyone in between. So I thought it was really important to do that. And I loved the idea of the mill looking over the town. And because our miller is a really, aggravating character who views himself as being literally above everyone, conceptually above everyone and literally above everyone, I thought it was good to have this windmill on the hill. So he is kind of almost on the same level as the abbey, like watching over the town. And so having that looming there, I thought was very important. And also having that as a high point made it a good visual point for a critical point in the story. So forgive me. There were a number of high ideas that I wanted to tell within Pentiment, things that I thought were important things to get across. And these were only possible by sort of creating the fiction that surrounds it. Historical people are more like us than not. This is important, I think. I think we often believe that historical people are really, 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 really different, and I don't believe that's true. Death and grief affect them. Obviously, we can't know the interior thoughts of all of these people, but there is a fair amount to suggest that death and grief do affect people. Infant mortality was extremely common. And this accounts for the low life or the short life expectancy. You know, when we look at average ages, it's in some times and places 50% infant mortality, 60% child mortality before the age of 12, which is in some ways kind of unfathomable. But it was a reality. And even if those numbers are deflated in certain times, like 30%, that's rough. So, you know, they had to deal with loss a lot, but that didn't mean that they were didn't care at all, let's say. Depression existed. One could argue that in this cursed earth that we now inhabit, that depression is far more common, but depression did exist in this time period. It was thought of as something called melancholia. Obviously, the causes of it were not understood, or they were thought of in a very different way. But people could get sad, existentially sad for long periods of time. So that was understood. People had personal beliefs. This is a kind of a weird one, but you know, I think that another sort of idea that comes across in a lot of retellings of history is that you know, peasantry especially were dumb and ignorant, which they might have been ignorant, but they weren't dumb. And there's plenty of records, actually, inquisitorial records, things of that nature, that would indicate that peasantry were perfectly intelligent, even if they weren't educated, and they were capable of examining their beliefs and either rejecting certain beliefs from the church or making up their own beliefs, which is very fascinating. So people did have personal beliefs, even if they weren't educated. History is not fact, nor is it truth. It's what's left behind. So Hilary Mantel, who also recently, unfortunately, passed, she wrote Wolf Hall, but she had a quote very similar to this, which is, what we understand as a study of history is people write things down for their own reasons and their own purposes, sometimes as accurately as they can, sometimes for ulterior motives. And then 80% of those records are destroyed through time. And we are left with some combination of ideas and thoughts and opinions, and then we have to try to make sense of them. So history is an extremely fragile thing, and it's important to remember that. And of course, each generation passes knowledge to the ones that follow. So this is not just true of written history, but oral history, paintings, all forms of communication that go generation to generation. And if those chains are broken, then information can be lost or confused, misunderstood. And this happens at a number of points in Pentiment when stories either drop or are distorted over time. There are also some mundane ideas about history I thought were important to explore. Salt. Salt was incredibly important, even in pre-Roman times. A lot of the tribes that lived in Central Europe were big on salt, very, very important, and it formed the kind of the foundation of a lot of trade networks and communities that exist today. Salzburg is salt fortress, very, very important. Double monasteries existed, double monasteries where there are monks and nuns. Not a lot of them, and by this point in time, there were not many of them, but they were around, and they're very interesting, I think. Roman settlements were the foundations of many cities. This is probably much more obvious to actual Europeans, but yes, Rome spread far, and after they left foundations that were built upon for centuries. Pagan and folk beliefs were very often incorporated into Christian beliefs, and not in a malicious way or even in a surreptitious way, but just because people were trying to make sense of the beliefs that they had before Christianity came, and how they could incorporate those into Christian beliefs. So it's called syncretism, and it's very important for understanding how a lot of traditions developed in various parts of Europe. And yeah, good stuff. Saints' relics, very important. Saints' relics were a big deal. They were a big deal for communities. They were a big deal for churches, and could become the focus of pilgrimages. People would come and pray to saints. If a town had a saint's relic, It was a source of pride. It was very important, and people would pray to their patron saint. And if a religious community denied access to those relics, it was a big deal. It was very serious. It wasn't quite the same as something like an interdiction or a excommunication, but it was a big deal. Black Africans, they were represented in popular art, and they were present in very small numbers. Obviously, I don't want to overstate this because there is a point at which this becomes a little bit silly, but they were around. They were in the court of the Duke of Baden-Württemberg. They were present. Ethiopians were present at the Council of Constance. They were in Portugal at this time, appealing for aid against their enemies. And then, of course, very notably, St. Moritz, who was quite a popular saint in this period of time, was at this time portrayed as a Black African. So it's worth talking about and mentioning. Hey, Romanian Jews. They existed. Romani were sort of coming in around this time, maybe a little bit earlier. Jews had been here for a long time. Their existence, not easy. It was quite perilous at times, but they were around. So worth mentioning and talking about. Queer people, neurodivergent people, people with disabilities, they all existed and survived. It's a very complicated thing to talk about because the way that societies navigated the existence of these people when there was prejudice against them, and in some cases even laws against them, was very tricky, but it happened. They existed. They were around. They didn't deal with it necessarily in the same way that we deal with it, but it happened. So it's part of the history of this world. Kearsarge Abbey. Let's talk about this fictional place. This is one half of Pentiment's setting. It's a Benedictine abbey in Upper Bavaria. That's a normal thing. It's a double abbey. Well, this is a little less common. We have monks and nuns here. It has a still active scriptorium. In the 16th century, not likely. Visited by an Ethiopian priest. Okay, we're getting into very, very rare territory. But as I said, Ethiopians did come into Europe at this time. It's built on Roman ruins. Again, this is not a weird thing, but there's a lot of very specific things that are coming together here. And it is near a town. So this is a combination of very specific things that helps with the telling of these sort of like high ideas, but there was not a place that actually existed. Something I was actually very happy about is after the game came out, there were people who were living in Bavaria and had lived in Bavaria, and they thought that Kearsarge and Tassing were real places. And they thought they were real places both because of the names, and also the details are all actually pulled from real places in Bavaria. Now, none of those places have all of these things because it's the specific combination that works for Pentiment, but there were little bits and pieces that could all be pulled together. Tassing. All right, so this is the other half of Pentiment's setting. It's a town in Bavaria with St. Moritz as its patron. This in itself is not crazy. There are still places that have St. Moritz as their patron. He was very popular in this time period. He was the patron of the emperor, so big deal. It's on the Imperial Road from Tyrol, so this is getting a little more specific. It's built on Roman ruins, even more specific, and it has another fictional patron saint. And by fictional, I mean completely made up, no basis whatsoever. And it has a town church founded from a Marian apparition near a Benedictine abbey. So this is, again, a combination of some of these things are true or exist in specific real places, and others are completely fictional or just very far away. So the only way to make this work was to create Kearsarge and Tassing from other places. Again, almost every bullet point on here, you can find a town that qualifies, but all of them, it's just not possible. So let's talk about the extraordinarily improbable. By the way, the picture here is from the film of The Return of Martin Guerre. And I think that there is an interesting comment on this, which is there's a plot point, and I'm not trying to spoil anything, but there's a plot point in the story that is pulled really directly from this. And many people have said this is the least believable thing in the story of Pentiment. And it is the one thing that is directly pulled from historical records. Like, it's about as straight as you can possibly get of a retelling of it. So yes, the thing that seems the least probable is the thing that actually, as far as we can tell, happened. So anyway, The Return of Martin Guerre. I recommend the book, which is written by the very recently late, I'm very sad to hear it, Natalie Zemon Davis, who wrote she was a consultant for the movie and she wrote a book about her experiences on that. Very, very good, but she passed away in October, unfortunately. Great historian. Anyway, so how do we deal with the extraordinarily improbable? We had historical consultants. So yes, I have a degree in history. It is a baby degree, a bachelor's degree. So I did as much as I could, and then I went to experts to ask for their opinions. So could we have a professional artist with a university education? Christopher DeHamel, who I was very honored to have as a historical consultant. He is world renowned for his knowledge of manuscript production. He's written some fantastic books on that, which I recommend. He said, yes, having a professional artist get a university education, it's possible. The most likely route would be through Andreas's family making a connection to someone in the university system and gaining admittance through that way. Talented artists could have wealthy clients. This is very, very common, especially if they were well-renowned, so they could gain access in that way. Could we have a Benedictine double monastery in Upper Bavaria? Ed Kern helped me with this. He was my advisor at Lawrence, and he was one of our consultants. And yes, he did research. I knew that there were a few that were around at this time. Ed found out that there were a number in Germany and Switzerland and Austria, very small numbers, but they did exist, so it's possible. Could we have a secular illustrator working in a scriptorium? DeHamel said this is technically possible, but it's really unlikely by 1518. Really straining, again, possible, but really unlikely. And that's because there weren't really many, if any, monastic scriptoria operating in 1518. So by this point in time, the only manuscripts that were really being made, and when I say manuscript, I mean by hand, were deluxe manuscripts. And these were the super high-end, lavishly illustrated, very, very beautiful. These were very expensive. They were for very wealthy clients, and they were made by secular professionals. So they were made by people like Andreas, but they were made typically in guilds in big cities, or just in a private practice. So monastic scriptoria didn't really exist. So these present some problems, but the solution is to highlight the extraordinary, which is not to ignore it, but to actually lean into it. Damn, that's crazy. So the tactic here is that every time there's something that in this world and in this time isn't itself extraordinary, people comment on it. They say, this is really weird. This is kind of a strange thing. A recurring theme in the story is that Kearsarge is a place out of time. It's old-fashioned. It won't let go of the past. This is thematic, but also just it's functional. They have a scriptorium operating and nobody else does. So everything that is unusual is called out as such by people in the world. Here we have Lawrence Rotvogel in the very beginning of the game saying, a Nuremberger artist working in an abbey scriptorium in 1518. Oh, we should talk, Andreas. I must know the story. So this gives you a sense that this is not a normal thing. Things that are possible but improbable can exist in historical fiction, and that is fun and cool and good. So there are a number of imagined spaces which are sort of fictional but are based in historical ideas. We have these three places, the City of Reason, the City of Melancholia, and the City of Madness. And they are represented by different forms of, you could call them, let's say, like patterns. And they show the order, stagnation, and disorder in Andreas's mind. And these are based on historical ideas about ideal cities, labyrinths, and mazes, respectively. So the first one, the City of Reason, is based on a lot of 16th century ideas about ideal cities. This is something that was especially popular among Italian humanists. It was also popularized by Thomas More in England through the writing of Utopia. That is where the idea comes from. But there was this kind of Italian peculiar interest in laying out ideal cities, drawing maps of ideal cities, and talking about how you could navigate them, how they would be perfectly laid out for commerce and learning and defense. And so when Andreas goes to the City of Reason, he is navigating an ideal city, and he can traverse it kind of in any way. And that's why when you go through it, you can kind of approach it and approach the center from any direction. It's uncomplicated. It's very easy. Thank you, Ideal City. However, in the City of Melancholia, it is more meditative and long, and you have to follow a very long path to get to the center. There is only one way to go. You will go it every time. This is obviously symbolically important, but also it references the use of labyrinths in Christianity, where they are used for a meditative purpose, where often thinking and prayer would occur while following the course of a labyrinth. So this is also reflected in the church, Our Lady of the Labyrinth. So there's lots of ways that this is reflected, but Andreas, the layout of his city changes as his mental state changes. And then finally, we have the City of Madness, which in some ways is more of a classic maze. It has twists and turns. You can get lost, which you can't get lost in either of the other maps. And it represents the disorder of his mind. And yes, refacts, labyrinths and mazes are different like that. A labyrinth has a single path that you follow, and a maze is a thing that you can get lost in and take different paths through. So now let's talk about imagined people, because there are a few of these folks in here, but again, these are based in historical ideas. So we have Saint Grobian. He represents sort of Andreas's, let's say, id, and he is the patron saint of coarse and vulgar people. He is actually an invention of Sebastian Brandt, whom we'll talk about in a moment. And he is a very funny little guy, but he was extensively illustrated in The Ship of Fools, much of which we believe was illustrated by Albrecht Dürer. Of course, we have Socrates, classic guy. Socrates is the high-minded voice in Andreas's head. He is always the guy who says the most kind of idealistic thing, even if it is not the practical thing. It is very high-minded. And then we have Beatrice or Beatrice and Melancholia. And Beatrice is based on the Beatrice of the Divine Comedy. She is kind of there to be a guiding voice to Andreas that is caution and prudence at first, and then becomes kind of this paralyzing doubt later on in the story. So she transforms between them, but is based on the figure that Dante put into his Divine Comedy. And finally, we have Prester John. Prester John is a very, very interesting figure in this time period. He was a mythological figure believed to be and associated with the Emperor of Ethiopia. Is not the same person, but he was believed to be this incredible combination of like king and super pope. And there was this desire to reach the court of Prester John. Europeans had this idea of like finding the kingdom of Prester John. It is also, by the way, a focus of Bottolino, which I mentioned before, another historical fiction novel by Umberto Eco. So let's talk about the Ship of Fools, which only makes a brief appearance in the story. So the idea of the Ship of Fools actually goes back to either Socrates or Plato, I think. But it was popularized by Sebastian Brandt in 1494. He wrote a book, The Ship of Fools, which is about people's various follies and vices. It's kind of making fun of people who are ill-behaved, let's say, and using fools as the common element. And the idea of the Ship of Fools, where every person that is in charge of running something on the ship is ill-equipped to do it and will not ask anyone else for help. So it resulted in very funny and good illustrations and funny little stories about the fools. It contained over 100 woodcuts of the fools and their ship. Again, many of those are believed to have been done by Albrecht Dürer when he was in Basel. Sebastian Brandt is one of your ancestors? Nice. And the Ship of Fools is what transports Andreas to and from his ideal city. And then in Act 2, when the city becomes the city of Melancholia, the fools are just sort of listlessly lying around in the city, unable to do anything. And this is, I could do a whole talk just on this, but here you go. Here's a little bit. Let's talk about fonts and their historicity. So we wanted to have accurate fonts in our game. However, most 16th century bookhands and typefaces are illegible to a modern audience, or at least quite difficult to read. And in this time period, as German typographers were moving to make more printed books, they were using Fraktur. Fraktur means fractured. And what they took is they took they took black letter, Gothic handwriting, and they fractured it. They made individual pieces of type out of it. It's not that easy to read. Black letter, on a good day is not too hard, but a whole book of Fraktur, that's a little hard on the eyes. However, the important thing here is that the underlying truth here is that newer bookhands and typefaces were increasing accessibility for a wider audience of people. So we created a fiction to convey this truth to a modern audience by interpreting these bookhands and typefaces into a context that made sense for the modern audience. So to look at their inspirations here, you can see going around the horn, Pentiment, Peasant Cursive, and Cursive are based on the sort of 16th century handwriting samples that we found in Austria and Switzerland and Germany. Not super easy to read, so we tried to, or rather I should say Lettermatic. All credit for this goes to Lettermatic. They did a fantastic job. By the way, they have a big, if you look up Riley Cran or Lettermatic Pentiment, you'll find a big breakdown PDF about the way that they handled all this. It's amazing. So we try to interpret the shapes of the cursive without getting super stuck on literally interpreting it because it would be impossible to read. Pentiment, Humanist, and Printed. So Humanist is based on Humanist bookhand from the time period. So this is a mostly Italian form, but it later appeared in French and Flemish late 15th century manuscripts. It's quite easy to read, even for a modern audience. It's fantastic. So we were able to interpret that more or less directly. Printed is based on Jensen. So Nicholas Jensen was a French typographer. And as you can see, that is actually very easy to read even now. We still use Jensen and Jensen variants in typography today. It's a very, very readable typeface. So we made an interpretation as though it were made by Marie Druckerin. That's why it's called Druckerin actually internally. Marie developed the typeface and it's used for all the Italian clients that the Druckers serve as they come through the pass. Pentiment Textura is based on monastic scripts from that time period. Obviously, we want it to be more readable. So we did a lot of interpretation, especially of the capitals. The capitals often are the least recognizable thing. So Riley's team reworked those to be more reminiscent of modern capitals, and it worked out great. And then the thread puller. So this was Johann Frober. Oh, no, that's not the guy. Oh, I can't remember, but he's an Augsburger calligrapher, and he had some really fantastic examples that we pulled from for the thread puller font. It's used in only a few scenes, but it's obviously very impactful. So let's talk about illuminating in the margins, which was quite fun to do. So we had a glossary system in Pentiment. This was based on a system that was first developed in Tyranny and later used in Deadfire. A lot of people think that we made it up for Deadfire. That's not true. I believe it was Matt McLean's idea, used in Tyranny, and it was fantastic. It was used for lore, and we decided to extend it for this game. So there were a few things that we ran into here that were a little tricky. So history is essentially lore for the real world. But what level of familiarity should we assume? We can't define everything. So various things that came up during development were, should we define what an abbot is? Should we define what Jesus Christ is? For example, if this is going to go into a market where Christianity is just not very common, do we need to define these things? So that posed some challenges to us. So we needed to think about that. And then the question is, how much detail should we give about these things? Should we give a little bit of detail or should we go crazy? So thankfully, we were limited by space, and that helped a lot. So we didn't want every line of dialogue to have tons of references. I believe that it maxes out at 4, which is quite uncommon. 3 is unusual. Usually there's 1 or 2, and that's fine. So what that meant is that we needed to cut things off. Abbot is not a thing that's defined. You can probably, if you don't know what an abbot is, you'll probably figure it out in the first couple of hours. He's the guy that runs the abbey. Great, you figured it out. Jesus Christ, it's so foundational to what Christianity is. It felt like if we define that, we're going to define literally everything here, and that's going to get really tricky. So we drew the line above that point and said, no, this is only for more esoteric things. St. Moritz, Holy Lance, perfectly reasonable that you would not understand or know what these things are. And no one would accuse me of not writing enough text. So the space limitations actually were a benefit because we just gave players the bare minimum to understand what the thing or the character or the event's context was in the story. And if you're interested in it, you can go to Wikipedia. We don't need to include Wikipedia inside of our game. So this limitation actually proved very valuable to us. So now that we're at the end here, let's talk about a few things. So for Pentiment, historical fiction was really necessary. There are a bunch of ideas that I wanted to get across. The only way to do that was to create this kind of fantastic, unlikely, improbable, but ultimately possible story. Plausible historical fiction does require as much rigor as historical interpretation. So, I mean, you can kind of freewheel it and do whatever you want. But if you want to tell a story that's really convincing, it feels grounded, then you're going to have to do a lot of research. But I will say, even if you're doing something that is quote unquote like strict historical interpretation, there are gaps there. There are things that you're going to fill in. You need fiction to bridge those gaps. We don't know what everyone said at every moment of every event, with very few exceptions. So you're going to have to do a little bit of fiction work anyway. And it's important to remember that not everything has to be explained in great detail. There's a lot in Pentiment that we assume you will pick up through context or through just the nature of the story, and the rest we leave in minor asides in the margins, and you'll pick up the rest as you go. So all of this is to say, if you want to tell a story in the frame of history, consider using historical fiction to tell a greater truth within that frame. Thank you very much. All right, and now I'm going to go to storytime mode so we can take some questions. Okay, just one moment. I think we need to slow this on down, Chris. Unless it's already in slow mode. Thank you. I'm very sorry, Refax, but I'm glad he got to see it. Slagathor, how do I feel about historical fiction that takes place in close proximity to historic events? For example, Sharp following Wellington's campaign in the Peninsular War. Is it better for historical fiction to take place far away from widely studied events to constrain the narrative less? I don't know. I think there's a cool blend there. I think Sharp, one of the reasons why I think Sharp is popular is, I mean, it's a swashbuckling tale. They're good stories and good characters, but I think because it is told in close proximity to the events of the Peninsular Wars, if people are into Napoleon, then they're going to get a little more juice out of that, right? I think that differs a little bit maybe from The Duelists, at least the film, where it'll say like, we're in Strasbourg. We're in Strasbourg, it's the turn of the century. You're like, okay, cool. Or we're in Russia, it's 1812, get ready. So I think that telling it in close proximity can give people a little more who are into the topic. It can give them a little more to work with. And I mean, obviously Sharp does some pretty extraordinary things, specifically with Wellington. I think that's a matter of taste, right? I don't mind that stuff. I think it's kind of cool. But yeah, I mean, for Pentiment, I liked that it was just off in the middle of nowhere and I could kind of just do whatever I wanted. And that was the appeal to me. Big Sud, how do you feel about using older methods of worldly comprehension as a fact, or at least accepted fact within the narrative? Can it add depth, or is it prone to, for lack of a better term, intellectual self-indulgence? Things like Aristotelian physics, a medieval understanding of the mind, humorism. Ars Magica is the most prominent example, but there are plenty of others. I think the thing is, I think if you approach those things in good faith, which is to say, the people of this time period believe this, or believe it to an extent, and may even be skeptical or critical of it, I think that's the right way to approach it. We have a point in our story where you talk with the Italian doctors, and one of our consultants that I didn't talk about, Winston Black, who was a classmate of mine actually in college, and he now talks a lot about medieval medicine. But around this point in time, there's a lot of questioning of using Pliny the Elder as a reference because it's so old. And they were saying like, okay, this has worked sort of, but don't you think we should examine it more closely? Don't you think we should see if there's a better reference for this? So I think that if you use their reference points, but have them engage with them as people of intelligence who are capable of believing in things, but also being critical in a way that feels plausible, then I think that's fine. I think that's good. I think it can kind of feel silly when it's used as a way to show how dumb people were. Because again, they're not dumb, but they had limited technology, and they, for the most part, they did the best they could. And sometimes that was, they just didn't have a lot to work with. So, all right. Do, 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 do. SLC Turk, historian here. Do you think game devs have an ethical obligation to try to keep close to established historical narratives, especially since for many players, the game is the only time they'll encounter that history? I think it's tricky. I do think, again, I remember when I was quite young, Braveheart came out, and I was like, man, you are really playing fast and loose with this. And now I don't, they're major events, and there's some total fiction in that, completely made up horseshit. And it's tricky because many people will see that and they'll come away and they'll think this is how this went down and this is how these people were. And they probably weren't like that. And none of that stuff happened, or a lot of it really didn't happen, or it didn't happen that way. So I think there is a responsibility there. And I think here's the thing that I think is really true is if your goal in changing the story is actually to distort the sense of what happened, the underlying concept of what went down, that I think is messed up. That I think is not good. I think if you are really trying to say, actually, this is fundamentally completely different than every record we have of it says that it happened, then I think you're on ethically pretty shaky ground. However, I do think that sometimes you got to file some corners and make things fit to tell a story, but you got to be careful. Um, do 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 do. Oh, okay. WM13542. Just wanted to shout out my boy Italo Calvino. He talks about this idea of a piece of art having the goal of containing everything, with examples in one of the texts of his 6 memos for the next millennium. Highly recommend. So I have not read a lot of Italo Calvino, but I did read his Italian folk tales. And one thing that I took away from some of Calvino's stuff is that folk tales get changed a lot over time, but they retain common elements and they kind of shift. So one thing I did with that is that when Andreas tells his fantastic stories to Ursula in Act One, none of those are the strict retelling of the original story. They're all slightly different. Oranges instead of, I think, pears. They're just details that are changed. And some people who have read that said, like, well, that's wrong. But the thing is, like, things that are passed down orally like that, they're just going to change. That's the nature of folktales. So, yes, Italo Calvino, very good. I recommend it a great deal. Um, Shadow. Honestly, Tassing was really believable. For a lot of the details, I could think of a village or a city near me with something similar. Was it difficult to find the right balance so that it doesn't feel like too much is happening for a simple village? It was difficult. I think one of the things that helped a lot is that I decided that it was on the Imperial Road. So having it be pretty close to Innsbruck and on a major road or very close to a major road made it more likely that there were Italians visiting, and just that it got a little more attention. Would there be a printing press there? That's maybe one of the least likely things. But it was even explained as like, oh, we sell books to travelers that are coming through, which is like, okay, all right, sure, we could do that. But I do think the proximity, and also suggesting that the town is a little bit bigger than maybe it appears to be, which we try to do with like things in the distance. So yeah, it obviously it sort of strains credulity in a few ways, but hopefully it's not completely unbelievable. Um, sorry, just Visionary Sign. How refreshing was it to do a more low stakes and slice of life game compared to the usual games that are coming out today? Very. I kind of like telling stories that are more about basic things, and I think it's easier to sort of tell things that are relatable when it's about people that are fairly ordinary. And yes, they're kind of caught up in a big conspiracy and wars and things like that. But it's nice to tell a story that's just about kind of essentially at the heart of it, middle class and peasantry, people just trying to get by. So it was a nice change of pace. Asymmetrical Axle, what do you think about historical fictions that change history like Inglorious Bastards? So, in contrast to Braveheart, I like Inglorious Bastards because it is so obviously, excuse me, a complete an alternate history, that it has fun with that, and I think that that's totally fine. If you want to tell a historical fiction story where it's a completely different thing, and there's no, well, at least I would hope that there's no one who thinks that that actually happened. That's cool. So it's a historical fiction that turns into historical fantasy, which I think is, I don't know, I think it's kind of cool. Um, Sorry, let me scroll a little bit more. Any thoughts about combining historical figures into one more well known person? Norse history tends to attribute many things to Ragnar Lothbrok that probably were done by a number of historical figures, but he is the most well known. Is it understandable or should it be decompressed ideally? I mean, ideally, sure, but I do think that I've seen a lot of historical films especially will do this where there's a major character and the major character is a singular figure. And then there's usually a support character, a support figure, and the character is a composite of a number of people. And it's done because there were usually a number of characters around, or people, not characters. There are a number of people around the central figure who are advising them and influential in their life. And it's just not possible to sort of tell that story of every single one of those characters. So I understand why that sometimes needs to happen for the sake of pacing, keeping characters straight, and things like that. So I get it. I mean, ideally, sure, but sometimes again, you got to kind of cut some corners and make it work. I think that's okay. All right, I'll answer like two more. Do I have any advice for dealing with historical fiction in more mechanics focused games like RPGs? Often mechanics won't really align with historical facts, and you want players to be creative and have possibilities and not just be sad peasants. Well, sure. So you want to make a game that is enjoyable. It's a good experience. So what a good experience is will vary from person to person. But I think the thing is you want that experience to be enjoyable, but if you want to lean really heavily into the historical aspects, then try to think of how you can make something fun, or let's move away from fun, enjoyable, because not often the thing is enjoyable is not even fun. It's a friction or it's dealing with adversity. But trying to make it work within history rather than saying, well, we have to break it in this way. Now, the thing is, what that can force you to do is you will have to be more creative. I mean, one of the games that I refer to a lot as an inspiration to make a historical game is Darklands. And Darklands did not use the conventions of D&D, which was and still is kind of the dominant force in tabletop role playing. So Darklands said, okay, we don't have spells, we have alchemical formulae, and you make potions. And you don't have cleric spells, you pray to saints. And so it said, I want to have the magic, I want to have this cool feeling, but I am not going to do it the way that other games do it. I'm going to frame it as much within a historical understanding of the world as I can, which I think is a really cool way to do it. All right, I'll answer one more. Big Sud, Václav was a wonderful character and one of the few fellow Romani I've seen portrayed in good faith I've seen in a long time. Where did you pursue research on him? Please forgive the use of this term because it is the title of a book, but and it is an older book. Angus Fraser's The Gypsies was something I read quite a long time ago, and that started sort of an interest in Romani and their history and their way of integrating into Europe, which was a very, very interesting book. And I feel like if I had a greater understanding of Romani culture, I might have tried to do more with that. But I conceived of Václav as a very solitary character, and there are a number of reasons for that. But I thought it was better to leave that somewhat mysterious. I feel like his profession and the fact that he moves around is fairly true to what we understand of Romani history in that time period. However, his education and his very peculiar beliefs are just kind of left to be a crazy mystery. So, how did he get so educated? How did he learn to read? All of these things are just sort of things about a mysterious character that are left in the background. All right, I think it's probably it for now. But if you did not see it before, I'll put it up again. You can contact me, preferably through Tumblr. Email, one, spam catches a lot of stuff, but if you want me to answer a question, probably go to my Tumblr. You can try also asking me stuff on Twitter, although that's mostly for shit posting. But yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to Chris for helping to moderate. And yes, I will upload, well, the VOD will be available immediately, and I will also upload this to YouTube when I get around to it. So thank you very much, and see you later.